This is John Byrne from AML RightSource, and this is another edition of AML Conversations. I'm very pleased to have with me today two key folks that are dramatically engaged and have been for quite a while in the world of antiquities from a variety of spaces, but from our perspective, the importance of detecting, identifying, reporting, and understanding how cultural artifacts can be used to move illicit funds. It's much more than that, but sort of the key theme is to try to better understand that world. So I have with me Deborah Lehr, who is the founder and chairman of the Antiquities Coalition, Tess Davis, general counsel, and she has a number of other roles with the organization. Both have been so kind to us here at RightSource in previous iterations. We've done webinars, we've done podcasts, but I thought it'd be a good time to sort of restate where we are and get some advice from both of you on how our community can be better prepared to deal with, as I just said, the abuse of cultural artifacts for criminal and other nefarious purposes. So let me start with this, Deborah, if you wouldn't mind. The coalition, which I'm well aware of, and I was proud to be part of your financial crime task force a few years ago. Can you tell us the mission and the goals of the Antiquities Coalition? And then obviously, Tess, feel free to add anything.
Well, John, thank you so much for having us back on. We're so appreciative of the support that you and the broader AML community have given us in this fight really against how art can be used to really move around illicit funds, and for really helping to put a spotlight on some of the important issues. So the Antiquities Coalition was really inspired after the Arab Spring, when we started hearing reports of mass looting that was going on across the Middle East. And there appeared to be limited policy and legal tools that could be used at that time to stop it. So as a group of former government officials, mostly in the US government, but we have some from the UK, some from the Middle East, some from international institutions, we came together to take a look at what was the regulatory and policy framework, both in our individual countries and on the global stage, to see where were the gaps, what could be used on an immediate term, and how we could start to help. And that's really how we got started. We got started with Egypt, helping them negotiate a cultural MOU with the United States, and bringing together then in Egypt countries from 10 different ministers from around the Middle East to really start to promote cooperation in that area, since, as you know, it's not a crime that is linked to just one country. It can't be resolved with just Egypt putting in place better laws. It requires a global effort, but particularly a regional effort. And so that's really what we started. So we've been, excited to see the progress that we've been able to make, and at least getting the political will there, the recognition at the highest levels of the United Nations, in the G20 now, in the G7, in organizations like NATO, with the AML, working with other countries to try and get anti-money laundering laws changed to cover art and antiquities, and making some progress here in the United States.
And Tess, as a lawyer, certainly you understand the challenge that this is a global problem. So even if you have laws in certain jurisdictions that give law enforcement, prosecutors the ability to go after criminals, if it's not done in other jurisdictions, or the laws aren't as vibrant, that's going to be problematic. So another organization that I know you folks have had some work with is the Financial Action Task Force, because I know that they put out some reports on art and antiquities. But tell us, again, sort of build on what Deborah just mentioned, the importance of this being a collaborative effort among various jurisdictions. Because again, if you have a couple of countries that get it, but there's many that don't, then it's going to be incomplete, right?
Yes, just as Deborah was saying, cultural racketeering doesn't stop at any one country's borders. A piece may be looted in Egypt, transported to Switzerland, laundered through their market, and then eventually end up in a U.S. museum. And as you both have mentioned, we've also seen in recent years, criminals are getting more creative. If you're looting and trafficking millions or even tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars worth of antiquities, you then have to hide the proceeds of those crimes. So we're seeing criminals also doing, money laundering, and other criminals have realized that the same weaknesses in the art market that make it vulnerable to looting and trafficking and theft, also make it an easy playground to not just launder money, but evade sanctions, evade taxes, commit fraud and forgery, abuse shell companies and offshore jurisdictions. It's really a good playground for those who seek to take advantage of these weaknesses.
Deborah, what do folks not? I mean, both of you are obviously well versed in the world of cultural artifacts on all sorts of levels that I couldn't begin to explain. From being it, some of you have been involved with digs, archaeological digs, and obviously dealing with all this. What would you say to compliance officers, those in the anti-money laundering space that now are generally aware that this is a problem, but don't really understand the significance? Not that they don't believe it affects economies and cultures and all those things, and I know you could explain it in a couple, we can have a couple of hour conversation, but what would you say to people that say, okay, that sounds great, that sounds important, but I have to deal with drug trafficking and human trafficking. Why is this, from your folks' perspective, so essential that we get this right?
I think there are several different reasons, and one, we're very pleased to have seen over the course of the last 10 years since we launched, growing awareness that this is an issue that people need to pay attention to. Previously, it was looked at almost as a victimless crime, but as we've seen with ISIS, if we've seen with Russia, very deliberately targeting cultural heritage for destruction as a form of cultural genocide, and being very targeted in as they go in to loot some of these sites, knowing that there's a market for these items and using that as a way of their own public relations. And I think when it comes to the financial community, particularly those in areas of private wealth management and others who are advising their clients, to be aware when they look around the world at what's happening, to know that when there are hotspots, as there was in Cambodia in the 70s, as we've seen across the Middle East with the Arab Spring and with the rise of ISIS, as we've seen now in Russia, to be aware that as antiquities from that part of the world are now coming into the global marketplace, whether it's for auction, whether it's in some of the big dealerships, that they're being very careful about the recommendations that they're making to their clients about purchasing these items, and not to always have faith in the provenance research that is being done by those individual institutions, but ensuring that they're doing it themselves, knowing that at least here in the United States, the regulatory structure is still very murky when it comes to these purchases.
I know, Tess, that you've written and been quoted in various publications over the past couple of years for the need for increased transparency, building on what Deborah just said. So from museums and art galleries, I'm going to shift to the art world in a little bit, but sort of build off of what Deborah just mentioned, the importance of knowing the source of a particular artifact. And I'll not prejudice your answer, but I'll say you guys invited me to a meeting. This is how I got involved in this, I don't know, 6-7 years ago in DC. And I remember somebody in that room, and I don't think it was one of you folks, but basically said, if you are taking a piece of art or an artifact and putting it in your house, putting it on your mantle, and you don't know where it comes from, that tells people that are in your home a lot about you, that you didn't care. Now, I know that's a simplistic description of that, but you've taken that to a level to talk about what you see are, my words, not yours, but correct me if I'm wrong, the gaps in what museums and art dealers and others, what they don't do to ensure the source of a particular piece of art or artifact.
Yes, exactly. And we feel that museums have a unique responsibility, but also an opportunity to really make a global difference in this area. One reason is that we're never going to see better standards from the for-profit art market than we see from public institutions like museums. And so it is their duty to set the gold standard here. And I think there's often a tendency to act like the situation is changing around them. But again, the main convention in this area is about half a century old now. It's time that we fully implement it. And we're seeing too many gaps happen, too many mistakes continuing to happen. But on the flip side of that, we're also seeing a lot of positive change and you know museums who can use these obstacles as a stepping stone to improve relationships with countries around the world, with local communities and with governments.
Deborah?
John, I think it's also important to flag for your listeners something that you alluded to, and that's about the individual responsibility. We know that authorities are now looking at photographs, they're looking through magazines, they're talking with dealers and auction houses about these purchases, and they will come raid and arrest, and we have seen this, and indict. And so people should be exceedingly cautious about these purchases. It's not just that they don't care, it's that not knowing doesn't mean you're not complicit and you can be held accountable for those purchases.
Yeah, your lawyers know that as willful blindness, right, Tess? The concept of suspecting something but not doing any checking at all, but knowing that there should be some checking done, which is a phrase that's been used in the anti-money laundering space for 30 years. So Deborah, I get your point very clearly. Let's talk a bit about the change that we've seen, at least in terms of legislation. I know we don't have a regulation yet, but based on the great work that you folks did prior to the passage in late 2020, I guess was signed in early 2021. Part of the National Defense Authorization Act included this broad-based anti-money laundering law that our community is well aware of, known as AMLA. And in that part, for the very first time, they've placed the antiquities world, and I'll let you guys define how they defined it, under the Bank Secrecy Act. There's been a proposal from the Treasury Department, but it's yet to be finalized, and it's not given anyone any state secrets. But I talked to some, as you have as well, some Treasury folks in the past couple of weeks and asked them, what's the status of that? And they said, basically, we got a lot of other things on our plate, but we'll get to it. As we know, that's a broad-based law with regulations. But Tess, I'll start with you. Define at least how you perceive the antiquities definition within the U.S. laws now. And like I said, we don't have the reg yet. We're hoping there'll be something certainly within 2025, which obviously will go to a great degree to what Deborah and you have hoped for quite a while, that there'll be, in addition to requirements, enforcement, and this will actually be a robust, hopefully, infrastructure.
Thank you, John. It'll be interesting to see how they do end up defining antiquity, and also whether the broader art market is added at a later date. And I think, actually, if it is expanded to the full art market, that will actually be helpful, and because then you won't even have to deal as much with the definition of antiquity. But we do know that's something they've been struggling with. Right. Deborah, anything to add to that?
I would just add that the trend that we are seeing globally is to bring these industries under this kind of regulatory structure because of the very reasons, John, you were talking about earlier. They're being used to avoid sanctions. Mm-hmm. They're being used to illicitly transfer money. And to have the world's largest art market, the United States, not having these issues, to be still self-regulated and non-transparent, does not send the kind of signal that we should be sending around the world about our concerns. And when the facts show that Russians, that financiers of terrorism in the Middle East have been actively using our own market for this kind of fundraising, we should be concerned, and we should be leaders in setting the standards. even Switzerland, who has been a challenge when it comes to transshipment of art and the whole issues around the lack of transparency of Freeport, has brought this under the anti-money laundering regulations now, and the United States hasn't.
Let me move to an op-ed piece, Deborah, that you wrote back in March. It appeared in the Financial Times, and it's on your website. Title is the Antiquities Coalition warns that the U.S. art market is a sanctions black hole. Now, you just made a reference to sanctions before that can be used to evade sanctions. We should remind people that the Treasury did do a study and looked at the art world separate and apart from what's in AMLA and said, yes, art can be used to launder products or movement illicit funds, but it was, quote, I'm paraphrasing, it's not a priority right now. So we know that at least they admitted, based on research, some of the things that you pointed out, but remind people your key points in that op-ed piece and what we've seen. We haven't seen any changes, but what you think can happen, not just based on that, but what you've done. You've talked to policy leaders, I'm sure. We're in the, there's like another month left in this Congress, so it's probably pretty remote chance there'll be any legislation passed, but who knows, right? So bring us up to speed.
Sure. And I think it's worth pointing out that Treasury study was mandated by Congress after the Senate did its own study, and they found that sanctions were being evaded using art. So then they mandated that Treasury take action. I can understand at one level, while there are so many major issues going on, should they change something that in many cases is not perceived as broken? And we know that the art market has very powerful allies who do spend a lot of time here in Washington. We hear from a number of them directly ourselves about some of the activity that's going on. But when there are people questioning, at least in the antiquities world, if there's even a legitimate market at this date, given how much the illicit trade is going on, and continuing concerns about the fact that you don't have to disclose who the buyer is, who the seller is, and that their art market is thriving in the secondary markets. And we know at least the published amounts coming out of the auction houses and some of the dealers are in the hundreds of millions sometimes for some of these purchases, that there's a lot of opportunity. And we've had law enforcement even come and talk to us how when they used to go do a raid, they would be looking for drugs and guns, and they would be looking in drawers and things like that. They would not be looking on the walls. And now they're looking on the walls. And so I do think that we need to keep up the pressure for Treasury to take action, either through executive order, or that we hope, and there's been some talk on the Hill, of a bipartisan effort to come together to extend the NDAA passage that covered antiquities to now include art.
Yeah, and Tess, as Deborah has mentioned, you folks have been approached by the art world, as have I, suggesting that we don't understand what best practices already do, that sort of thing. And I can just tell you from decades of working in this space, that was something the bankers talked about early on in the 80s, saying, well, we're doing these best practices. It's never the same as actual regulation. I don't care what anyone says. And to Deborah's point, the Senate Permanent Investigation Subcommittee proved its point. Treasury obviously endorsed that there's a problem. We've seen the FATF weigh in on this, the UN, of course. So the bottom line, Tess, continues to be that if you're simply going to cover the world that you folks are in, antiquities, no matter how that's defined, but you're going to leave art to the sidelines and to best practices, criminals are going to figure that out pretty quickly.
Yes, exactly. And, we too believe we are by no means, we believe strongly in a responsible art market and think that this is possible. And hoping too that AML will be a protection for the responsible players in the art market as well. We would hope that the auction houses and companies that have AML programs already, especially if they are this strong, would be leading the charge for a
Sure.
regulation, since they are supposedly doing all of this anyway. And until there is a regulation, their competitors are getting by without this level of care. So why would you want your competitors to have an advantage over you? So hopefully a regulation would, level the playing field for them as well and protect the vast majority of responsible people in the art market. There are excellent guidelines for protecting the art market from money laundering and sanctions evasion out there. A key initiative is the Responsible Art Market Initiative out of Geneva. And while that guidance is geared toward the art market, it could also be used very easily by those in the financial sector who intersect with this world. So definitely wanted to promote that as a resource of guidelines that are out there.
And one of the critiques is always something along the lines of this will impact small business. This will hurt, my words, mom and pop operations. But as we've seen for many, many years, when regulations are crafted, you have a public comment process. You have the ability to point out, and maybe they'll end up being a threshold. Maybe they'll end up being the sales of over X, you're covered, under you're not, that sort of thing. So that's always a possibility. And the Treasury Department, FinCEN specifically, when they craft these regs, are not looking to put people out of business regardless of what anybody might think. It's an open process. It's a transparent process. So I think that's an important point to make. One of your colleagues it's Helena, pronouncing that correctly. She wrote a blog post just back in May, which I thought was pretty interesting. And I know we don't have her on, but maybe you can comment on this. And it's basically responding to something in the New York Times about the state of young art collectors and museum donors, that maybe there's a hesitancy because there's eventually going to be legal oversight. The premise sort of escaped me, but Helena's point was, you're going to lose these young collectors unless you do some proactive things, including advocate, as you just said before, Tess, for the regulation of the American art market to safeguard against risk. What are some of the other things that make sense, based on her perspective, your perspective on, again, the next generation of art collectors, and trying to let them know that understanding where the source of something comes from, it's not a bad thing. You can still be a very successful art seller or collector, right?
Very much so. And we've seen some of the smaller auction houses, I think, realize this. One that comes to mind is a place called Revere Auction Houses. And I was talking to some of their leadership years ago, and something he said struck with me. How many people under 50 or 60 do you see bidding at antiquities auctions? Not a lot. And you would think the market would be concerned about this, especially upcoming generations are very focused on corporate responsibility, supply chain issues, things like that, and that translates to art. And likewise with museums, I think we're seeing increased calls across the board for responsible behavior from our public institutions, including museums, including work with local community, again, supply chain issues and things like that. So I think there's a real opportunity for the ones that are doing good work to benefit from that, and again, hopefully drag the others along with them. So hopefully that's something we'll continue to see.
I'm going to give you some last time for some last comments, but I also wanted to highlight that just last month in July, you folks hosted a cultural racketeering and corruption 2-day workshop training session with the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, which I think is it's an important note to remember to make, because you guys are continually training on typologies, financial crime examples, and all of that. I don't know if either of you were there, but is any highlights from that you want to mention in terms of both the importance of doing these workshops, the global nature of it, and maybe some takeaways from that program?
Yes, we feel that there is a great opportunity to make better use of some of the UN tools that are out there, including the Conventions Against Transnational Organized Crime and the Convention Against Corruption. And corruption is an important issue. The UN defines corruption as including both the public and the private sector, so it does include the market, and it's necessary at every step of the process for these crimes to be successful. And the good thing is about tackling cultural racketeering as a financial crime, there are a lot of tools out there, low-hanging fruit, tools and resources, expertise that we can use that we feel are just beginning to be tapped into, whether there are these UN agreements or AML protections. There's a lot of opportunity, no need to reinvent the wheel. So we're glad to see this issue getting a lot more focus.
Deborah, just sort of last thoughts, as I said up front, from our community, that obviously they've become more engaged in the past several years based on all the great work you folks have done. Why is it still very important to pay attention to these? I'd call them adjacencies, but they're certainly they're very important in terms of the movement of illicit funds. There's so many different ways of doing that, and the fact that it's happening in this world that you folks are involved in. I think AML professionals want to know that. What else can you tell us? And also, how do folks get involved? How can they help the Antiquities Coalition or any of the coalitions that you folks are involved in? How can they be helpful?
Sure. John, first, we understand the vast majority of people have good intentions who are in this field. And as you said, we're not looking to put anybody out of business. We're simply looking to make sure that the loopholes of those individuals who do have bad intentions, who are trying to manipulate the market, and who take away from those who are trying to do the right thing, are stopped, and we close those loopholes. And that really is what the intent is here. And it's not saying everyone can be punished, because these are best practices that in many cases, individuals, the dealers, the auction houses, the museums are either engaged in or should be engaged in. Sure. So it's not a very high bar to have to get over, particularly in this day and age when everything's electronic. It's not that much more complicated to add just a few processes to the system to make it transparent and to share that information. And so it's, I don't think, something that's overly onerous, and it's being asked across many different industries. Even mom pawn shops have to declare. So the fact that you have the art market out there, I think, is sort of just a glaring gap that should be closed. In terms of ways that people can help, there's lots of training that can be done for the AML, and certainly with the Antiquities Coalition, we would be delighted to work with organizations, whether it's the investment banks or the various associations and the representatives, to help them understand what are the red flags that they should be looking for. They're very sophisticated in what they do, and just adding one or two of those other watch outs, I think, are really important. And certainly organizations can reach out to us on our website at the Antiquities Coalition to either sign up for that kind of training, participate in some of the training that we do, whether it's with international institutions like the UN or NATO or the G20, and finding ways that they can be more engaged.
And I'll end on this, as Tess said, and Deborah, you were mentioning as well. There are really good players in this space. The mere fact that the art market is saying, well, wait a second, here's what we're already doing, shows an awareness that they recognize it's time to either step up if they haven't, or recognize that responsible art market processes and other policies are important. But like your colleagues in the jewelry industry, the pawnbrokers, the non-bank, the non-traditional financial institutions, they have obligations. They're not the same as banks. They don't have to do the same series of requirements that traditional financial institutions do. And if it's good enough for jewelers and pawnbrokers and others, nobody likes compliance, but they recognize there's an end game here. And the end game is to just be working as solidly as you can, as proactively you can, to ensure that you do your best to make sure that the products that you're involved in aren't being used by criminals. So the antiquitiescoalition.org is the website. We will link to that when we post our conversation, but people can feel free to just go there. And Deborah and Tess, I'm sure I'm going to be coming back to you folks again when the regulations are final, and we can talk about some of the particular needs for not just training, but understanding. So thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much for such an engaging conversation.